This is basic history on the year 1917 of World War I. This year we start to see the cracks form everywhere from the strain of modern industrial war, and one empire will shatter into a bloody civil war under the pressure. Let's get started with a quick recap. 1916 was the year of quote-unquote great battles. We saw the bloody, inconclusive Battle of the Somme, the bloody French victory at Verdun, the massive Brusilov offensive that nearly knocked Austria-Hungary out of the war, the endless battles on the Isonzo River, and fighting in the Balkans and Romania, while in the Middle East the Ottomans had beaten back the British while fighting the Russians in Anatolia. Germany knew it could not hope to win the war of attrition it currently found itself in. So, on February 1st, they announced the recommencement of unrestricted submarine warfare in an attempt to starve out Great Britain. This would anger neutral nations such as the US, but Germany felt the gamble was necessary. In the Middle East, the British were resurgent as they recaptured Kut al-Aman, the site of their humiliating surrender last year, and by March 11th had entered Baghdad. The very next day, March 12th, the Russian Revolution began, as women waiting in endless bread lines started rioting, leading to a full-blown revolt. The Tsar would abdicate 3 days later, and a provincial government would be formed. They promised their allies Russia would remain in the war, but the political situation in Petrograd was volatile, to say the very least. And on April 6th, the United States declared war on Germany. Anger over unrestricted submarine warfare, the sinking of ships such as the Lusitania, and the infamous Zimmermann telegram, a secret telegram between Germany and Mexico, in which Germany tried to convince Mexico to attack the US if war were to break out. This telegram had been intercepted by the British, who passed it on to the US, finally leading to the United States entering the war. The US brought massive amounts of resources and men to the fight, but it would take months before they could reach France and have an effect on the war. China, Liberia, and Siam would also declare war on the Central Powers, with China providing tens of thousands of labourers to the Allies. Despite this, the German gamble on unrestricted submarine warfare seemed to be working, as in April they sunk the most amount of tonnage they had since the war began. On average, they were sinking 17 ships a day. On the Western Front, the Battle of Vimy Ridge was fought between April 9th and April 12th, and was an important strategic victory for the British. It was the first time the 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps had fought together, and they succeeded in capturing the important ridge, another example of British Dominion troops fighting excellence. Further south, on the 16th, France launched the Nivelle offensive, named after the French commander-in-chief, who we last saw leading the defence of Verdun. Despite some initial successes, the attacks quickly bogged down in the driving rain as the French had to slog uphill against German positions. The battle ended on May 9th with over 160,000 casualties on both sides. This catastrophic offensive led to a mutiny in the French army on the Western Front, as French soldiers refused to be sent on any more suicidal attacks. Philippe Pétain would be made the new French commander-in-chief after the debacle in an attempt to restore morale. Throughout March and April, the first and second battles of Gaza were fought, as Ottoman troops held back the advance of the Egyptian expeditionary forces under General Edmund Allenby, despite his army's brilliant crossing of the Sinai Peninsula. Also in March, Lawrence of Arabia led his first attack on the Hejaz Railway, as the Arabs continued their northwest advance. In Africa, the Allies finally would manage to push Letao Vorbeck out of East Africa by the end of 1917. He would, however, manage to cause far more casualties than he took, and also managed to dodge destruction and march into Portuguese Mozambique to plunder and loot, cementing his reputation as the greatest guerrilla commander ever, in my opinion. Turning now to Italy and the 10th Battle of the Isonzo. This was launched on the 12th of May, with the Italians making minor gains that Austria-Hungary retook with a counterattack on the 3rd of June. So when the battle ended around the 8th of June, no ground had changed hands and both sides had taken over 100,000 casualties. The stalemate in the mountains would continue. In June, King Constantine of Greece abdicated his throne and Greece joined the Allies. See, Greece had actually had two opposing governments since September of last year, with the king leading a pro-neutral faction while Prime Minister Venizelos, I know I butchered that name, don't even bother at me, but anyway, he led the ultimately victorious pro-Allied faction. The Greek army would join the Macedonian front against Bulgaria. Just a reminder that Greece was in fact neutral at the beginning of the war, just like Belgium. On June 26th, the first American troops landed in France, and on the 1st of July, the last Russian offensive began. Known as the Krasinski Offensive, who was the Russian Minister of War in the provincial government, it was a complete failure. The Russian army refused to advance. Morale and discipline completely collapsed. Tens of thousands of soldiers abandoned their posts and just went home. The Central Powers would begin advancing into Russia virtually unopposed. And on July 10th, the German Reichstag, the civilian parliament, passed a peace resolution. This peace called for no annexation, no indemnities, open seas, and international arbitration. It was refused by German High Command under Paul von Hindenburg, who now ran Germany as a military dictatorship. Moving back now to the Western Front, where on July 31st, the Great Allied Offensive of 1917 began with the Third Battle of Ypres. This battle, which would become known as Passchendaele, was a brutal attack in driving rain and sucking mud. It saw the first use of massed tanks, as 400 British tanks drove through several miles of German lines before being destroyed by German artillery or breaking down. The battle would end in November as an Allied victory after the Canadian Corps captured Passchendaele Ridge. However, the Germans were able to avoid a general withdrawal due to the rain and mud slowing the advance to a crawl. Moving back down south to Italy, where on the 18th of August, the 11th Battle of the Isonzo began. By the time it ended on the 12th of September, Italy had made some minor gains, but the real outcome of this battle was the complete and utter exhaustion of both sides. If Italy had attacked again, Austria-Hungary could not have stood against them, but Italy simply did not have the resources to attack. They were like two drunk punch boxers, neither side really able to deliver the knockout blow. Austria's ally Germany, who by September had occupied Riga and able to divert troops from the Eastern Front to Italy, and began preparing to deliver that knockout blow. And this would come on the 24th of October with the launching of the Battle of Caporetto, and was an outstanding Central Powers victory. They smashed through the Italian Second Army, advancing 150 kilometers to the Piave River, and took 265,000 prisoners along the way. Britain and France had to hurriedly move divisions that were desperately needed on the Western Front south to help stem the tide and prevent a complete Italian capitulation. On the 2nd of November 1917, the Balfour Declaration was released. This declaration by the British government was in support of a homeland for Jews in Palestine. This reneged on previous promises made to the Arabs and caused much concern that Lawrence of Arabia would have to work hard to soothe. This declaration, much like the Sykes-Picot before it, would have no ramifications for the future of this region at all. Things had not been going well in Russia since February. There was mass strikes, fighting in the streets, and general unrest, as the people demanded an end to the war. This came to a head on November 7th, with the October Revolution. Russia used a different calendar at the time. This revolt brought the Bolshevik Party under Vladimir Lenin into power, who promised a quick end to the war. An armistice would be signed on December 15th, and peace treaty negotiations would begin in Brest-Litovsk. Romania was left completely isolated and signed a separate armistice on the 9th of December. And just like that, the Eastern Front was over, and Germany could start sending tens of thousands of troops to the west. We're going to leave it there for 1917, which was a pretty dismal year for the Allies. Russia and Romania had just signed separate armistices, as we've just seen, closing the Eastern Front and allowing the Central Powers to send tens of thousands of its troops west, which had allowed them to smash the Italians at Caporetto. The French army had mutinied and remained shaky, while the British had managed only minor gains in the Middle East and on the Western Front. But the US was landing troops in France in ever greater numbers, and Germany knew that this would prove decisive in the long term. And so plans were laid for a massive spring offensive in 1918. Join us next time as we go into the final year of the Great War.